this lesson, we're going to take our solving absolute value equations and we're going to extend it. We're going to look at a case, a type of problem where you've got to be extra cautious and make sure you use your check. Now, what I'm going to point out, our objective is still I can solve absolute value equations, but in this case, notice that there's a variable inside the absolute value and there's a variable outside of the absolute value. In this case, you want to be very cautious about how you're doing it. Use all of your steps to solve it, just like we did before. The steps don't change to solve, but when you get to that last step of checking, be cautious, do your check, and make sure you see if all the answers are part of the solution. So let's do our, first of all, getting the absolute value by itself, isolating the absolute value. So let's divide both sides by 9. So you get the absolute value of 2 minus 4x, that quantity, equals, when you divide that by 9, you get negative 6x. Now we're going to set up our two cases just like before. So case 1 will be when we just take that absolute value and drop it. So we just have 2 minus 4x equals negative 6x. That's case 1, but don't forget case 2. Remember, your second case is where you take the opposite of what's inside that absolute value. So we replace the absolute value with parentheses, make it 2 minus 4x, and then we put an opposite in front of it. That equals negative 6x. Now, let's go ahead and solve both of these. I'm going to start this one. Now in this case, I'm going to get the x's together by adding 4x to both sides. So I get 2 equals, when I add 4x, I get a negative 2x. Divide by negative 2 on both sides, and you get x equal to negative 1. Let's check that. I'm actually going to write the check out in this case, just to emphasize how important it is when you have, that you have to do a check when you have a variable inside the absolute value and a variable that's not in the absolute value. So putting that negative 1 into the original, 9 times the absolute value of 2 minus 4 times negative 1 becomes a plus 4, equals negative 54 times negative 1 is a positive 54. So 9 times, and I'm going to put a question mark over this because we're checking to see if this is an equation, if it's actually equal. 9 times absolute value of 6 is just 6. Does that equal 54? It does, and so it checks. So one of our answers is x equals negative 1. Circle it just to remind us that it did work out. Let's check this one. First of all, let's distribute through the negative, so you get negative 2 plus 4x by doing opposites equals negative 6x. Let's subtract 4x from both sides. You get negative 2 equals, when you subtract that, you get negative 10x. Now I'm going to divide both sides by negative 10, and so you get x equal to negative 2 divided by negative 10. The negatives reduce out, so I get x and the 2 and the 10 reduce down to 1/5. So you get 1/5 for my solution. Now let's go ahead and do a check for this one as well. For this check, I'm going to put it back into the original. So the absolute value of 2 minus 4 times 1/5, 4 times that gives me 4/5. When I multiply a number by a fraction, you think of that as 4 over 1 times 1 over 5 is 4/5. And that equals, in this case, I'm going to put negative 54 times my 1/5. Think of that as negative 54 over 1 to multiply numerators and denominators. So I get 9 times the absolute value of, and we'll check, we're going to put a question mark over this because we're checking to see if they're the same. 2 minus 4/5 in this case is going to be equal to 1. That's going to be 2 over 1. Gives me a total of 10/5 minus 4/5 gives me 6/5. Does that equal negative 54 times 1/5 is negative 54/5. 9, the absolute value of 6/5 is just 6/5, so 9 times 6/5 is equal to, think of that as 9 over 1, that becomes 54/5. Does that equal negative 54/5? And the answer is no, it does not. So my 1/5 is not a solution. So my only solution in this problem is -1. So when we're solving absolute value equations, when you have a variable inside the absolute value and a variable outside, that last step of checking your answers is very important to guarantee. Sometimes you'll have both work, sometimes you won't. And in this case, only one of the two solutions work. So our answer to this one is -1.